Hi class, and I want to make this short video and talk to you all a little bit about Max Weber's lecture on science as vocation. And I'm going to begin by sort of talking about why I'm having you read it, and then sort of dip into some key ideas that will be important for us going forward. So first, why do I have you read it? Well, one of the things that we're going to be talking about in this class this semester is, how does psychology constitute itself as a science? How does it carve off its domain that makes it different from what's done in, other disciplines, right? How does it get its little place in the sun? And as part of that, I wanted to look at what it means for psychology to be a science, or, what do we mean when we talk about science anyway? And in particular, I wanted to get into what does they mean, the first generation of psychologists, when they talked about psychology being a science. And that takes us to Max Weber, who gives this essay as a lecture in 1918. And for the first part of the lecture, he spends some time describing the institutional differences between university life in Germany and the United States. It's not surprising that he would do that because he is a sociologist after all, but it's important for us because psychology is going to grow and emerge as a university discipline and within universities. And the structure of the university and the nature of the university is going to affect how psychology goes about getting its little place in the sun, how it shows that it's not redundant to other university departments, how it argues to have its own department and not be housed someplace else. And so having some insight into the life and structure of the early 20th century university will be helpful for seeing that. But secondly, this also gives us a chance to see someone from that time period when psychology was again sort of first beginning to emerge as a distinct subject, how he thought about science. And Max Weber is both, I think, representative of a certain tradition of thinking about science, and also in perhaps, not representative because he's so brilliant and so extreme. But sometimes the, extreme positions can help to sort of show in stark relief the implications of positions that are, not quite so extreme. So let's talk about Wissenschaft, right? So the title of the essay is, let me get it in front of me, Wissenschaft als Beruf. And Beruf is, vocation, and then Wissenschaft is the words that's getting translated as science. Wissenschaft in German is much broader than science is in English. All right. In English, science basically undisputably refers to things like physics, chemistry, biology, and maybe refers to psychology, economics, and sociology, right, depending on who you ask. And we sometimes, in English, sort of struggle around saying, well, you have your hard sciences and then your soft sciences, or your natural sciences and your social sciences and things like that, to try to add some specificity to what we mean, or to kind of stretch out what we mean when we're talking about science. In German, Wissenschaft is very broad. Philosophy is a Wissenschaft. The study of ancient languages is a Wissenschaft. The study of physics and chemistry is also Wissenschaften, right? Wissenschaft basically denotes almost anything that's done at a university, with the exception of extremely sort of practical forms of training, like say, like painting or sculpture or something like that. Although in the 1920s, that wouldn't have really been taught at a university. So Wissenschaft is much broader in German than in English, and that's going to be important for understanding some of the things that Weber says about what science can and can't do. Because he's not just talking about the hard sciences of astronomy, physics, and things like that, but he's really talking about any science, any Wissenschaft. What is the vocation of the Wissenschafter? What is the vocation of the scientist? Well, you could almost say that for Weber, it comes down to science for science's sake, right? The point of Wissenschaft is just Wissenschaft. Science, as Weber understands it, can not really answer any of the fundamental questions of life, right? This is where the broad meaning of Wissenschaft for Weber is important. He's not just saying that, physics and chemistry can't answer sort of like your fundamental existential questions about the meaning of life or right and wrong and things like that. But he actually means all sciences cannot. Philosophy can't. The study of history can't. Nothing can, right? But that doesn't, for Weber, make science sort of useless or bad or stupid, but it actually, for him, indicates sort of the purity of the scientific vocation, right? That science for science's sake is, in a way, for him, more pure and more noble than science for the sake of, existential concerns, or science for the sake of politics, or science for the sake of ethics, or anything like that. And in this, I think you could see the traces of Immanuel Kant's moral theory in the way Weber develops his idea of science. In Kant's moral theory, the only thing that matters in evaluating an action is the intention, right? So whether or not an action is good or bad for Kant solely depends on the intention of the actor, right? What they intended to achieve. And for Kant, right, so we're looking at the intention, and for Kant, there's one and only one intention that actually has moral worth. And ultimately that intention is to do your duty simply because it is your duty. Or, to put it in less sort of Kantian language, to do the right thing simply because it's right. Not for any effect or goal that it may achieve, but simply because it is right. And for Kant, this is often referred to as like the categorical imperative. That if I am willing in accordance with the categorical imperative, I'm basically doing my duty because it is my duty. I am doing what's right because it is right, and nothing else matters. There's sort of a purity to the moral intention for Kant. And I think you can see that in Weber's account of sort of what we could call like the scientific intention, right? That you're doing science because it's science, for no other reason. There are no extra scientific concerns that motivate you. That's not to say that there might not be extra scientific effects of one's researches, but that's not why you do research. And that may have certain knock-on benefits down the road, or it may not. It doesn't matter. All that matters is sort of the purity of the scientific intention. Now, what happens for Weber is that you might, in your researches, be led to a position where you sort of ask, like, okay, well, my research has shown that, X is a desirable thing to achieve, but my research has also shown that we can only achieve X by doing Y, which is, I don't like. So then you have to decide, says Weber, whether you are going to, pursue X, right, or not due to the negative consequences of Y. So you're in a position of deciding whether or not the end justifies the means, so to speak. And when you get to that place, he says, science can't help you. And in a sense, nothing can help you. Like, Weber has in a way been accused of being sort of something of a nihilist at base, that when you push things to the extreme and you really have to decide, there's no grounds for making decision. Right? You're just kind of bleh. And this is where he gets into, towards the end of the essay, this stuff about sort of like this return of polytheism, sort of a disenchanted polytheism. And the idea is that, in the ancient world, there were many gods. And the gods competed with each other, and the gods duked it out with each other. And, there was no sort of order to it. There wasn't a system, right? There might be one god that's like more powerful than others, but, he doesn't always get his way. So, proverbially, Zeus is the most powerful of the Greek gods, but he doesn't always get his way. Sometimes Hera finds ways to undermine Zeus or to punish him for this or that thing that he did. Weber's idea is like, in polytheism, you just have a bunch of these incommensurable gods just kind of like striving against each other. And what he thinks happens in the modern world, right, is you sort of have this disenchanted polytheism where we have a bunch of incommensurable values striving against each other, and there's really no way to decide between them. We do have to decide because we have to do things and we have to live, but that decision that we make is sort of ultimately, I don't want to say arbitrary, but it has no basis in any fact that we could discover through Wissenschaft. Is that all Wissenschaft can give us is facts. It can't give us values. It can't tell us what's right or wrong. It can tell us what's efficient or inefficient, but it can tell us maybe what works and what doesn't work, but it can't tell us what we should do or what we should not do. For Weber, this is okay because of his ideal, like the purity of scientific reasoning, that it should have no extra scientific concerns. It should just be focused, not be politically engaged, ethically engaged, or in like any other kind of engagement. It's science for science's sake. Like this idea that finds a very strong formulation in Weber is, as I sort of indicated before when I was talking about its roots in Kant, is widely spread and present throughout the German university system and sort of, I guess you say, German intellectual culture when psychology is first being formulated as a science and things. So one of the things that'll be of interest when we get a little farther into the class and we start to read the programmatic text of the first generation of psychologists will be to see how they frame their problem. And one of the things that'll be interesting to note is to see whether or not they frame the problems that they're seeking to address as psychologists in theoretical terms or other terms, like let's say in terms of like social benefit. There's a lot of interesting things in this paper, but the main things for y'all to look at as you read it is one, his sort of the purity of scientific intention as he sees it, right? Science for science's sake and nothing else, which leads to the inability of science to give you any value. A purely scientific approach is ultimately for Weber a nihilistic approach. Although he wouldn't use the term because it's kind of negative, but you can see there's a number of references and allusions to Nietzsche in the paper, and you can see he's kind of like trucking in that, and sort of in that direction, right? So that so Weber thinks that a scientist, a Wissenschaftler, should be purely disinterested and just sort of doing science for science's sake, in part because science can never give you any value. Science can basically only reveal facts about how things work and the relationships between things. And that this means, in turn, that in a purely scientific world, right, which Weber thinks that, this is in 1918, that we're living in an increasingly sort of science-driven, rationalized world, we sort of end up with this, what he calls disenchantment. Right? In this purely disenchanted world, there is no common set of value that everyone can sort of agree on, right? Instead, there's like this disenchanted polytheism with the different gods or values duking it out with each other, and there is not sort of one common core values for us to, latch down upon. And again, and part of what Weber is getting at is that there was a sense or a hope among some parties in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's been reborn again by certain people in the late 20th and early 21st century that science can be a source of value or a source of wisdom or anything like that. And Weber wants to say no, it can't be. All science can do is tell you how things work and things, and that most of us, right, don't really know how most things work, right? That we shouldn't congratulate ourselves for living in such a scientific age, because as he says, most people don't understand how their car works. I mean, they drive it, but unless you're a physicist or like a mechanical engineer, you really have no idea how it works. And so it's not that we are more rational, right? This is why he uses the language of disenchantment. It's not that we're more rational than peoples were earlier, but that the world that we live in is disenchanted more. So I don't want to belabor the point about disenchantment in Max Weber's work, but it is a crucial point to understand, especially in relationship to the theory of science that he's articulating, right? So science for science's sake is intimately related to this notion of disenchantment, because in part, and this becomes clearer in some of Weber's other texts, science is an agent of disenchantment. And the way this works is that as we practice science for science's sake and sort of emphasize the discovery of fact, the success of science, let's say, inadvertently and perhaps sometimes advertently and purposefully, or has the effect of disenchanting the world, right? That things that were once mysterious and sacred become, understood and transformed from mysteries into problems, and then the problems are solved. Now, this is, in Weber's case, this is both sort of, he sees this as both tragic, but also unavoidable. Because there is a sense, I think, in Weber's case, there's no such thing as what philosophers in later generations would call moral facts. Like Weber thinks that, one of the reasons why Weber thinks that there are no values that science can discover is because values aren't the kind of things that gets discovered by science. Now, that might seem like a truism or maybe even axiomatic to you, but that is also the lingering, let's say, hangover from the thought of Immanuel Kant action. So when psychology is being born as a science, we can look at action. So using this text from Max Weber, we can discern some helpful things about how psychology articulates its role as a science and some of the presuppositions that are built into a scientific conception of psychology. Right? One would be the question of science for science's sake, and then also sort of the atmosphere of disenchantment that accompanies that, according to Weber. And there is a sense, I think, in which we could readily recognize the way in which psychology does sort of presuppose a certain level of disenchantment of the world, right? The way a psychologist would approach questions of human behavior and human mental life is surely quite different from the way that Shakespeare or Aeschylus, Sophocles, or the authors of Gilgamesh would have approached it, to say nothing of philosophers, poets, and artists throughout the centuries, or even scientists prior to the late 19th and early 20th century. So I think it's sort of keeping with this theme of the question before the question. One of the questions before the questions of psychology, I'd say, is the question of disenchantment and the question of the purpose of science, and in particular the purpose of psychology. Is it psychology? Do we do psychology merely as science for science's sake? Or do we have other motives? And if so, is the having of these other motives in tension with the scientific character of psychology? And to answer that question, as I hope I've sort of made clear, or at least strongly suggested in this video, would require rethinking what exactly it is to take science as one's vocation. And with that, I'm going to wrap this up.